Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for a civil rights investigation, Mississippi burning with the LBJ Library. So during this guided discussion, participants will investigate the disappearance of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of 1964, examining telephone conversations, oral histories, and documents from the LBJ Library archives. Participants will explore the events of the summer of 1964 and the mystery of the missing young men as the nation was enwrapped with the passage of the Civil Rights Act through Congress. Join us for this fascinating story and the valiant efforts of young Americans as they fought for equality in America. And this afternoon's presentation is led by education specialist Mallory Linenberger, who is with the LBJ Presidential Library. So all 60 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mallory for joining us this afternoon. And Mallory, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
It's great to be with you all this afternoon. So thankful to be here. As you can see, I'm joining you from the Oval Office, not the real Oval Office. I'm joining you from Austin, Texas, and this is actually the replica Oval Office from the LBJ Presidential Library. So if you ever make it to Austin and you want to visit the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum, you can actually see this 7/8 size recreation of the Oval Office that looks as it did during President Johnson's presidency. And actually a lot of the artifacts, including the desk, are things that he actually used in the Oval Office. LBJ didn't use the Resolute desk. He had his desk from the Senate actually shipped over to the White House. So that's just a fun little fact. If you're not familiar with the Presidential Library System, we're a part of the National Archives and Records Administration. So if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., and you've seen the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the presidential libraries are affiliated with that big, beautiful building in Washington, D.C. and those documents. And basically, presidential libraries are specifically the caretakers of the documents from presidents and their presidencies. The LBJ Library is kind of unique because President Johnson was also Vice President Johnson and Senator Johnson and Representative Johnson. So we actually have documents dating all the way back to the 1930s during his first elected position. So today, we are going to actually be using some of the archives from the LBJ Presidential Library to go back in time. We're going to travel back to 1964, and we are going to investigate a crime that happened. We're going to investigate the disappearance of 3 civil rights workers. So as I go through, we are going to see all kinds of primary sources, but we're going to focus on telephone conversations, which were actually kind of unique to the presidential library, or President Johnson. He's one of a few presidents who recorded conversations that happened in the telephone at the Oval Office and his office here in Texas, just outside of Austin at the LBJ Ranch. And so we have this really interesting peek inside of his administration and how he made decisions and who he talked to. So we're going to be getting some behind the scenes evidence today with some telephone conversations with some important players and people on the national level who are trying to figure out what happened in Mississippi in 1964. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right in. So as all investigations go, I'm going to give you a briefing. This is just kind of the context setting, the historical background setting. These events take place in 1964, the summer of 1964. And in the United States, the summer of 1964.
Mallory, can I interrupt you for a second? Can you hear me, Mallory?
Absolutely.
Mallory,
Yes.
I don't think you're sharing your screen. Did you want to share your screen?
Oh my God. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was like, just going.
Yeah,
okay.
and make sure to optimize for sound. Yeah, that's okay.
Yes, Thank you so much.
No worries.
I was just so excited. All right, here we are. Can you see now?
We can, perfect.
Okay, so, excuse me. All right. So we're going to start with the briefing and background. So we're in the summer of 1964, specifically Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer was a time that lots of volunteers, college-age volunteers, traveled to Mississippi to help register Black voters. So in 1964, according to the Constitution, African Americans could vote. However, in the South, in states like Mississippi, that wasn't necessarily practiced. There were lots of barriers, both formal and informal barriers, and a lot of times, violence that could happen if Black Americans tried to register to vote or tried to exercise their right to vote. So this movement was led by the Congress of Racial Equality, which was kind of a conglomeration of several different kind of college age activist groups and civil rights organizations. And so they were traveling to Mississippi specifically to help register voters, because Mississippi in 1964, compared to all of the other Southern states, had the highest population of Black Americans, but the lowest percentage of those Black Americans registered to vote. Okay, so we can see there's a clear discrepancy of representation, and obviously that those rights have been, in many different kinds of ways, muted or just taken away altogether. Another thing that you should know in our briefing is that the Ku Klux Klan membership in Mississippi at the time was about 10,000 people. This information might become relevant in our investigation. And then the last thing that you need to know before we get started is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is moving through Congress. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when it is eventually passed, spoiler alert, is it actually, among many things, one of the major things that it does is end segregation in public places in the United States. And that's in law, not always in practice. And of course, we know of a lot of examples of ways, especially schools and other institutions, that continue to be desegregated into the 1970s and 80s. All right, so we also need to know where all of this is happening. So the two main places that we're going to be talking about today are Meridian, Mississippi. This is the location of the CORE, or Congress of Racial Equality headquarters. So this is where the civil rights workers are headquartered, where they're staying. We're also going to hear about Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is the location of Mount Zion Church and the jail that we talk about. All right, so some people of interest that you need to know about before we dive into the events of the summer of 1964 in Mississippi are, these are our three civil rights workers. They are Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. And these civil rights workers, Michael Schwerner was the leader of Congress of Racial Equality in Meridian, Mississippi. He was from New York State, and he attended Michigan State University and eventually went to the School of Social Work at Columbia, and he was the leader of CORE. James Chaney was actually from Meridian, Mississippi, and he was working as a volunteer with the Congress of Racial Equality also. And then Andrew Goodman was a college student volunteer. He was actually a student at Queens College in New York. And many of the volunteers, hundreds of volunteers who came to Mississippi for Freedom Summer, were college students from northern universities. All right, real quick, we're going to also hear from the governor of Mississippi, Paul Johnson, no relation to Lyndon Johnson. We will also hear from both of the senators that are elected to the federal government, Senator James Eastland and Senator John Stennis. And of course, from the federal government, we will hear from President Johnson, and we will also hear from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. So just from this kind of briefing, we know there's the jail, we know the federal government gets involved, a lot of high-level politicians get involved. And so I'm just going to go ahead and dive into the timeline of events leading up to the disappearance of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. So this all starts on June 21st, 1964. This is just days after the Congress of Racial Equality. All these volunteers have come to Mississippi to register Black voters. And Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman decide to go visit Mount Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia, just north of Meridian, where they're all staying, because they had been burned by the KKK. Now, in considering, that churches were a main place of organizing for civil rights in the 1960s, there were lots of reasons that the Ku Klux Klan might burn a church. I'm sure that you all have probably heard about this in your history classes. Hopefully you did. Or that of course the most well-known civil rights organizer was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So there was lots of affiliation and connection between Black churches and civil rights organizing. And so not only was damaging this Black church actually damaging the place where organizing is going on to further equality, it also is intimidation, it's violence, and it is meant to scare people. So Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney decide to go and visit the people that they've been working with in organizing at Mount Zion Church to see how they can help and what they can do after this fire happened on June 21st, 1964. And so as they are actually returning to Meridian, Mississippi, at 4 p.m., they are arrested for speeding, and they are brought to jail in Philadelphia. All right. Then, sorry, I keep pressing my space bar instead of my mouse. Okay, then at 5:30, we have records from the Congress of Racial Equality. They realize that their friends haven't returned. And of course, civil rights organizers and activists at this time, they knew going to Mississippi was risky. They know that, whatever kind of act they're doing is risky. So they have lots of plans in place and lots of protocols to hopefully, keep everyone safe. And so they notice that their friends are not back. And so the members of the Congress of Racial Equality back in Meridian, they just start calling all the local jails and hospitals. And at 5:30, they call the jail in Philadelphia, where Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman are. But the jail shows no record of that call, and they tell the core worker who called that there's no one here by those names. Then at 10 o'clock, the 3 civil rights workers are released from jail after collecting their fine for speeding, and they left to return back to Meridian. And then June 22nd, 1964, the next day, the FBI is called to Mississippi. So if we kind of step back here, we see some unusual things. We see that, these 3 young men are arrested for speeding and brought to jail. Okay. Then we see that they are held in jail for speeding for several hours, for almost 6 hours. And then we see that the FBI is called to Mississippi the very next day because these 3 young men are missing. Now, normally in a missing person's case, it takes 24, 48 hours, sometimes more for federal authorities or even local authorities to get involved. And so there was a lot of unusual circumstances here. So we're going to actually look at some evidence to see what happened to James, Cheney, and Yeah, I'm seeing your comments in the chat. Yes, some things haven't changed, unfortunately. So I want to go back just 1 second. Oops. Sorry. Oh no, I went back too far. Hold on. Bear with me. So sorry. All right. So the FBI is called. These 3 young men never return to Meridian, Mississippi, to Corps headquarters. The FBI is called, and what we're going to do is we're going to use these primary sources to investigate their disappearance. Okay, so this is our first primary source. We're going to look into some telephone conversations. What you're seeing right here is actually an excerpt of the president's daily diary. So during every day of President Johnson's presidency, there are many pages per day that look like this and basically track everything that President Johnson did. Sometimes they say what he ate for breakfast, how much he weighed. There are things that are on the record and off the record. There are descriptions of meetings he had and who was there. And so these are in research, like these are so helpful because you can, if you know the day that something happened, you can kind of backtrack and see what resources might be available to you. So we see right here, the highlighted area is that there are 2 conversations that happen on June 23rd, the day after the FBI goes to Mississippi, 2 days after the 3 civil rights workers go to visit Mount Zion Church and never return. There are 2 telephone conversations, one at 3:59 and one at 4:05. And we're going to listen to some excerpts of these telephone conversations with President Johnson and Senator James Eastland of Mississippi, and also of J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. All right. So first, our first piece of evidence, we are going to hear a couple of clips of a telephone conversation between President Johnson and Senator James Eastland. So from this picture, obviously this photograph is not from this actual conversation because they're in person, they're at the White House. You can see President Johnson leaning over to pet this little white dog. That's his dog, Yuki. And you can see that he and Senator Eastland look pretty familiar with each other, familiar enough for Yuki to jump right up in Senator Eastland's lap. So keep in mind that President Johnson was a senator before he was vice president, before he was president. He was a senator from Texas, from the South. And so he and Senator Eastland have a long relationship, and you'll hear that kind of in the dynamic between them. And so as you're listening to this conversation, I want you to listen and listen to who is speaking. If there's any words or phrases that stand out, if you have words or phrases that stand out to you and you want to add them to the chat, feel free. And kind of think about what this conversation is telling us. By the end, we kind of want to think about, okay, what new information do we know now about these missing people? And for bonus points, kind of thinking analytically about what this tells us about this time in history. Okay, so there's going to be 3 kind of short clips. I'll pause for just a second in between them. The first voice that you're going to hear is President Johnson's, and he says, "We got 3 kids missing down there. What can we do about it?" Okay, so you'll then be able to kind of tell who is Senator Eastland and who is President Johnson.
Jim, we got 3 kids missing down there. What can I do about it?
Well, I don't know. I don't believe there's 3 missing.
We got their parents down here.
I believe it's a publicity stunt.
They say that their parents are here and they've come down to see the Attorney General, and they've seen Burt Marshall, and they're going to be interviewed by the FBI as a parent. And they've got some newspaper people and some photographers with them, and a couple of congressmen, Congressman Ryan and this Republican Congressman Ogden Reed, whose folks used to own the Herald Tribune in New York.
Yeah.
They want to come to the White House to see the president. And I told them that I thought that would be better to let Lee White, who handles matters like that, for me, talk to him, and he'd go up to Ryan's office and talk to him. I don't know whether that's going to be satisfactory or not.
All right, so if you want to in the chat, what are from this first clip, a few big takeaways that you think are really important? A publicity stunt, denial that it's happened, a cover up on the part of the senator, Eastland saying that he doesn't believe there's anyone missing. He's denying it. Yes. All right. So he says he thinks it's a publicity stunt. No one's missing. Did you guys notice that President Johnson talked about how there were people from the press there? And so he's concerned. He wants to know, you know, he needs some answers. He wants to know there are the parents of these missing young men are wanting a meeting with him at the White House, and so he's hoping to get some information from oh, excuse me, sorry. Hold on, let me try. Oh goodness, my mouse. Okay, so we can see that you know, he's concerned. He wants some information. Let me make sure that we're on the right slide. Hang on. Okay.
Yeah, into it several weeks ago. I asked them to anticipate the problems that would come from this, and they've sent extra FBI personnel in the area. They've substantially augmented their personnel in the last few hours, and that's all I said.
Well, that's all right. Now, I'm going to tell you why I don't think there's a damn thing to it. They were put in jail in Philadelphia, in East Mississippi, right next to John Stennis' home county. And they were going to Meridian. There's not a Ku Klux Klan in that area. There's not a citizens council in that area. There's no organized white man in that area. So that's why I think it's a publicity stunt. Now, if it had happened in other areas, I would pay more attention to it. But I happen to know that some of these bombings where nobody gets hurt, publicity stunts.
All right, now from the second clip, what is he saying? Yeah, he acknowledges that they were in jail. Yes, on one hand, we see that we know now that it wasn't a publicity stunt, but on the other hand, they expected something violent. President Johnson talked about how he had alerted the FBI, they had alerted the authorities, you know, that this was happening. Actually, there's in our archives a letter from the national leaders of the Congress of Racial Equality and leaders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, letting President Johnson know that this was happening. So they knew, and they had been in contact actually with one of President Johnson's aides, Lee White, who handled a lot of civil rights affairs for President Johnson. And so yeah, they knew that something bad could happen. And so they were trying to, you know, trying to figure out what's going on. And then Senator Eastland denies that there are any KKK in that specific area in East Mississippi. Do you think that that's true? A big no. Yeah, I mean, we saw at the beginning, I gave you some numbers that at this time there's over 10,000 members of the KKK in Mississippi. Now, even, yeah, who burned the church down? We just talked about that. The KKK burned the church down. So we know that there are KKK in or around that area. And even if there was just one hole where there, you know, one little spot of Mississippi where there were 0 members of the Ku Klux Klan, Mississippi is not that big, and they're within driving distance, I'm sure. People can travel, exactly. And so Senator Eastland's statements are pretty troubling. All right, there should be one last small clip.
Question about these three that are missing. Who is it to harm them? There's no white organizations in that area of Mississippi. Who could possibly harm them?
Well, might have some crank or some nut. Like they locked a man up in Minneapolis today for saying he's going to kill me Friday when I go out there.
It'll take a crowd to make three men disappear.
Well, it depends on the kind of men, Jim.
Huh?
It depends on the kind of men.
Well, there's nobody in that area to harm them.
It might take a big crowd to take three like you.
Well,
I imagine it wouldn't take many to capture me.
well, I'd run.
All right. Well, now you get that rein for both of us and send it on east when you get through using it.
Okay, so yes, it might take a crowd to make several men or these three men disappear, and President Johnson says it depends on the kind of men. So let's keep moving on. Now, just remember the previous call started at 3:59. This call with J. Edgar Hoover starts at 4:05. Really, there was really less than a minute between the time that President Johnson hung up with Senator Eastland and was then on the phone with J. Edgar Hoover. And Director Hoover, FBI Director Hoover, has some new developments and important news to share with President Johnson regarding this case.
Mr. President, I wanted to let you know we have found the car.
Yeah.
Now, this is not known, nobody knows this at all, but the car was burned, and we do not know yet whether any bodies are inside of the car because of the intense heat that still is in the area of the car. The license plates on the car are the same that was on the car that was in Philadelphia, Mississippi yesterday. And apparently this is off to the side of the road. It wasn't going toward Meridian, but is going in the opposite direction. Now, whether there anybody's in the car, we won't know until we can get into the car ourselves. We've got agents, of course, on the ground, and as soon as we get definite word, I'll, of course, get word to you. But I did want you to know that apparently what's happened, these men have been killed. Although, as I say, we can't tell whether anybody's in there in view of the intense heat.
Well, now, what would make you think they'd been killed?
Because of the fact that it is the same car that they were in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and the same license number is on the outside of the car. Now, as I say, the heat is so intense you can't tell on the inside that everything's been burned, whether there are any charred bodies or not. It is merely an assumption that probably they were burned in the car. On the other hand, they may have been taken out and killed on the outside.
Or maybe kidnapped and locked up.
How's that?
Or maybe kidnapped and locked up.
Well, I would doubt whether those people down there would even give them that much of a break. But of course, we're going to go into that very thoroughly. Not only as to the fact as to whether they're still alive. If they're not in the car, then they may have been killed and their bodies buried in one of those swamps down there.
Where did you find the car? How far from Philadelphia?
The car was about, I'd say, 8 miles from Philadelphia, but not in the direction of Meridian. It was in the opposite direction. Now, they had left Philadelphia, according to the reports that we had earlier, to go to Meridian, which is about 20 miles. This, however, was on State Highway 21, and the car was off to the side of the highway, although it can be seen from the highway. And an Indian agent, there's an Indian reservation down in that area, although the car is not on the reservation. An Indian agent saw the car and immediately notified us, and we went there, and there we found this condition.
How long had the car been burnt, you reckon? 6, 8 hours?
Well, we frankly don't know. The intense heat would have indicated that the car probably had been burning for maybe 6 hours or 5 or 6 hours.
What would you indicate? They filled it with gasoline and...
I would think so, yes. There wasn't any indication of any explosion like dynamite or anything of that kind. And of course, dynamite wouldn't have caused the intense heat and fire that kerosene or gasoline would have.
Well, looks like a fellow jumped out of a car burning.
Well, you would think they would, unless they'd been bound and were locked in that car, and then the car set afire.
Well, why wouldn't an agent be able to look at the car and see if there's any bones in it?
See whether there are any bodies in it?
Any bones, yeah.
Well, the reason for that is the car is so burned and charred with heat that you can't get close to it, except that we did get the license number, which is on the outside of the car.
You mean it's still burning?
Well, the car is still burning, yes.
You mean, do you think this happened in the last few minutes then?
No, I don't think it's the last few minutes. I think it's happened within the last maybe 5 or 6 hours. You see, they didn't leave there until sometime yesterday, I think it was.
Okay, you call me as soon as you can. Now, this group's coming down here to see Lee White, my assistant.
Yes.
You think in the light of this that this congressman, both of them raised and helped me to see him, you think I ought to step in, just tell him I've talked to you and you're doing everything you can?
I think it would be all right. I don't like to have you having to see these people, because we're going to have more cases like this down south. And every time that it occurs, they're going to have these families come on here to watch.
All right. Yeah. So there was a lot that happened there in that conversation. Hoover proclaims that these 3 men are dead, even though he said that he doesn't have the bodies. There's no sign of the bodies. They haven't found the bodies yet. But he just assumes that they are dead after finding the car, even though he doesn't know for sure if the bodies are in the car or if they're somewhere else. So we hear a lot in this telephone conversation that kind of tells us about the environment, the very dangerous and violent environment in Mississippi at this time, specifically violent towards Black people and people who are white people who are helping Black people. Yes, Hoover, knows the dangers of this, and he says we're going to have a lot more cases like this. He specifically advises the president of, about seeing the congressman and the parents. He doesn't want him to set this precedent that every time something like this happens, that they expect that they can see the president may or may not have time for them. And then what would that look like? And Hoover has been in the FBI for a long time. He understands when he's drawing this conclusion, he has a lot of historical evidence to back it up as to what happened to these young men. He even says at one point, LBJ suggests, maybe they got kidnapped and they were taken somewhere else. And J. Edgar Hoover responds, I doubt those people down there would even give them that much of a chance. And so we see that there's a lot of things that tell us about Mississippi, about the violence of the fight for civil rights. And yes, he's acknowledging the reality of the Ku Klux Klan and that it's a dangerous situation. It's a dangerous situation. Now, I have a couple of things that I want to show y'all. So here are some photographs from the FBI of the car when they found it off of the side of the road. You can see this is after it stopped burning, obviously. And you can see that obviously the fire was very, very hot to completely melt, this dashboard, and we can see the wire down of the seat, but no fabric. And so we can see that this, was probably very scary. And if the car was burning that hot, obviously somebody was going to see it, even though it was pushed off into the brush off the side of the road. Now, this is a map from the FBI. And this asterisk right here shows where the car was located on Highway 21, about 91 feet off the highway. So we have our civil rights workers are staying in Meridian, and they were taken to jail in Philadelphia. That's also where the church was that they went to visit. Now, if you were going from Philadelphia to Meridian, what route would you take? The most direct route is 19, right? It goes straight between the two. Yes, exactly. But the car was found up here off of 21. And remember, part of the conversation, J. Edgar Hoover says this several times, is that the car was found off of the highway, but facing in the opposite direction of Philadelphia. So how did the car get there? Why was it facing the opposite direction? Why was it up off of 21 instead of somewhere off of 19? Were the men in the car? Were they not in the car? What happened to them? All right. So I want you to kind of just think about in your head your own theories and ideas of what you think has happened. If you don't already know what has happened. The car being left off of 21 is kind of bizarre. It doesn't really seem to make sense. Did they even ever make it out of the jail? Great question. Why were they held in the jail for so long? The KKK was trying to hide the evidence until they could destroy it. Yeah. Okay. Let's keep going. Oh, they were released from the jail to the KKK. They were chased out of town by the KKK. All very possible, all very relevant to this story. Okay, so we're going to keep going in our evidence. So the next evidence is on June 24th. So the telephone conversations that we just heard were on June 23rd. The FBI came to Mississippi on June 22nd, and the men went missing. They were arrested on June 21st. So we're just a few days later still, okay? This is a telegram from Senator John Stennis, he's the other senator. We've heard from Eastland on the telephone. This is a telegram from John Stennis, who's the other senator from Mississippi. And he's writing to President Johnson at the White House. Now, I don't know how well y'all can see this, but I will go ahead and do a dramatic reading of this telegram. And I want you to listen for specific language that's used and the implications of that language. And then I want y'all to think about when you hear Senator Eastland and you hear or read Senator Stennis's words, these are two of the top elected officials from the state of Mississippi, what this kind of tells us about what's going on in Mississippi. All right, so he says, to the president at the White House, I submit that you can effectively deal with this invasion of Mississippi problem by using your influence as president of the United States and urging all those planning to go there on this so-called crusade to reconsider and abandon their mission, and to advise those already there to leave at once. This could and would end the matter in the course of a few hours. As a citizen of Mississippi and as a member of the United States Senate, I urge you to do this. With your background and firsthand experience and personal knowledge of the feelings, customs, and traditions of those in the South, you know that the continued onslaught of outside agitators into our state can only pour oil on the already troubled waters. Respectfully, John Stennis, United States Senators. Yeah. Stennis says that the solution is for the student activists to stay away. It almost seems like he's insinuating that if they hadn't come there in the first place, like this is on them, they should have known. Using the word invasion. So one thing that whenever I present this telegram, whether it's to adult learners, to high school students, to teachers, is if you deleted all of the information, Mississippi, the date, if you kind of just deleted all that time and place type of information, you would assume by the language used that like there is a foreign country or entity trying to invade the United States are trying to invade Mississippi. And so this, the language is very strong. The language is very coded. We also have the telegram correspondence between President Johnson and Governor George Wallace, governor of Alabama, before there was, Selma, the first attempted march that ended in violence. And then there was a lot of back and forth between Governor Wallace and President Johnson. And there's some very similar coded language about so-called crusade, these so-called activists. And so this is, so yes, a couple of people have pointed to this language of, you with your background and firsthand experience and personal knowledge of the feelings, customs, and traditions of the South, like you understand this. You are from Texas, like you should know, what's going on here. And what customs and traditions is he alluding to? What is he talking about? He's talking about segregation, right? He's talking about white supremacy. He's talking about anti-Blackness. And, yes, the Ronald Reagan speech was definitely an interesting place to have a speech, and definitely a dog whistle, I think, to Southern white voters. All right, so we've heard from both senators. We've heard how there's no KKK and that, President Johnson needs to preserve the customs and traditions of the South. So we're going to fast forward a couple weeks. All right, so here we see the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed on July 2nd, or it was signed into law on July 2nd by President Johnson. And so like we talked about before, one of the major things that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did was make segregation in public places illegal. Now, as you can imagine, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, lots of different groups of people reacted in different ways. Obviously, there are people who are very happy about this, and there were lots of people who were unhappy about this because it's changing, it's upending. People are losing power. White people are losing power. It's upending, a certain custom and way of life that Senator Stennis was, alluding to. And so, as you can imagine, there were lots of racial violence and uprising that happened after the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And they actually, as they were looking for Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, they're continuing to look for them. And as they are looking for these 3 civil rights workers, they end up finding the bodies of 9 other young Black men. A few of them were wearing Congress of Racial Equality t-shirts. So we can assume that at least some of these young men's bodies, dead bodies that were found, in search of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, they were found by accident. And so what I would like to know is, why do you think that the FBI wasn't out looking for those 9 bodies already? Why was there this huge search for these specific 3 young men? I'll wait if anybody wants to take some guesses in the chat. Yes, because 2 of them were white. The parents have connections. And so this is the thing, is that, remember at the beginning in the telephone conversation with Senator Eastland, not only were the parents in Washington, D.C., but also their congressmen. And so there's obviously a lot of pressure in the news. This is on the front page of all the papers, on the nightly news. And there was pressure from the press, from the parents, and those white parents. James Chaney's mother also participated, but with the support, obviously, it would have been very different. She probably would have gotten a very different result had she gone there by herself, not with the parents of two white men. And so just thinking about the power dynamics of who has power, who feels empowered and has agency and safety to go to their elected officials and demand that something be done, that they have the audacity to go to the White House and ask for an appointment with the president. So obviously yes, and Rita Schwerner, Michael Schwerner's wife, she was very, very, very outspoken. And if you all, there's a few documentaries and things I can recommend to you all if you're interested in this case. But Rita Schwerner was very dedicated at trying to push for the federal government to do something. Because we also think about, did Stennis and Eastland seem like they were willing to do something to find out what happened to these young men? Eastland didn't even think they were really missing. He thought it was a publicity stunt. So, going to the federal government at this point was one of the only ways to really see something happen. All right, so we're jumping ahead again. I'm trying to make note of time and be a good steward of your time. So the bodies were discovered in an earthen dam on a farm on August 4th, 1964. All right, so it's been, the end of June, all of July, and it's the beginning of August that the bodies are found. Now, there's lots of correspondence and telephone conversations that happened the day the bodies were discovered. I'm going to have you listen to one that happened the next day because they know a little bit more information because some time has passed. Now, for all of you people who know a lot about history, you might find it interesting whenever I was looking at the president's daily diary on August 4th to see kind of when the telephone conversations happened. The president not only was dealing with this crisis and learning that the three men had been found and trying to contact their parents, but also the first Gulf of Tonkin incident happened on August 4th, 1964. So in between all of, things that are going on in Mississippi, President Johnson is also having meetings with the National Security Council and Secretary of Defense McNamara to try and figure out what to do there. So it was a very busy day. And that page of the daily diary, one of the things I think that is so valuable about those primary sources is you can really see, how a president has to jump back and forth between so many different issues in one day, and not even small issues. Sometimes they're huge issues in one day. And, it's not like President Johnson can just, say, okay, today we're going to focus on civil rights. Tomorrow we'll focus on the war on Vietnam. The next day we'll focus on the war on poverty. All of these things are going on all at once. And speaking of the war on poverty, in between all of these National Security Council meetings and, speaking with FBI Director Hoover and the parents of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, he's also making calls to congressmen trying to get them to vote for war on poverty legislation. So he's definitely a busy guy. So we're going to hear the day after the bodies were discovered from J. Edgar Hoover and get some information about what they've gathered so far.
Very nice of you. You might be interested. The physical examination showed that each of these men had been shot. Huh. The two white men had been shot once each, and the colored fellow was shot 3 times. Oh. And we have the names of the people who did it. Now, to prove it is going to be a little tougher job. The sheriff was in on it. The deputy sheriff was in on it. The justice of the peace was in on it. And there were 7 other men. But we have all those names, and as I say, we're concentrating now on developing the evidence. We're going to call a grand jury in possibly the next 2 weeks concerning the burning of the church and bring before the grand jury these
particularly 10 men, and hoping that one of them may then break. But I think we're going to be able to clean that one up. The one in Georgia is making very good progress. I've been in touch with the boys down there. I think we're going to have that one cleared up. We know who participated in that also. It's the Klan in both places. But I think we'll be able to make a favorable report on breaking those cases within the next month, possibly.
Well, mighty proud of you. You take it easy now and just stay out there until you get damn tired of it, and then come in and see me when you get back, and I'll buy you lunch.
Oh, that's awful nice of Mr. President.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you.
so much.
Bye.
All right, so we have found out a lot of information that the men had been shot. James Chaney had been shot 3 times. He had been shot more than the 2 white men that he was with. And you know, he says that we know who did it, but to prove it's going to be another thing. Now, why do you think proving it might be so difficult? People are afraid to be witnesses. The officials were involved. So many people were in on it. People in power were in on it. Yes. All right. Law enforcement was involved. Yes, yes, yes. Due to time, I am going to just tell you what this oral history says. So Governor Paul Johnson, this oral history was taken in 1970. So this is years after the events that we've been talking about. In this oral history, though, he specifically talks about how he knew the men who did it, how they helped him get elected, and how they didn't intend to kill them. But James Chaney decided to, you know, he was talking too much, he was a smart aleck, and so they hit him over the head with a trace chain and killed him. And so they decided that if he was dead, they had to kill the other 2 as well. Now, if he died from getting hit with basically a huge chain that would like go on like a tractor or something, why did they shoot him 3 times? Now, I don't know. Obviously, there had been trials that had happened between 1964 and 1970. I don't know how much of that information Governor Johnson knew before, or how much of that had been public information that he put together with information that he knew from the men. But I will say he seemed to know a lot about it. And so thinking again back to the power dynamics of these very influential, powerful people knowing what happened and not pursuing any kind of justice is very upsetting, and something that I think is not unique to the 1960s, and it's not unique to Mississippi. All right, so I'm going to really quickly kind of go through the timeline of what happened in the trials. So in January of 1965, obviously there were no local charges ever filed. Normally murder is a local charge. It's not a federal charge, okay? So because the local authorities were in on it, it was the justice of the peace, like we heard from J. Edgar Hoover, justice of the peace, the sheriff, the deputy sheriff, were all in on it. So no local charges were going to be brought because the people who would be doing that did it. Federal charges were attempted to be brought for violation of the 3 young men's civil rights, and those charges were dismissed. In 1966, the Supreme Court actually says that violation of civil rights applies to civilians, not just law enforcement, not just certain people, not just elected officials. So this kind of opens the door. Since the case had been dismissed before, they hadn't been, it's not double jeopardy. They refile the charges. And the trial begins in October of 1967. Only 7 are found guilty, and no one served more than 6 years. The man, Edgar Ray Killen, who it was his property that they found the bodies on, he walked because the jury refused to convict a minister. He was a Baptist preacher. So fast forward to 1999. There is, in Jackson, Mississippi, there's a reporter who ends up reporting on some information of people who were living at the time, who remained anonymous, about these murders. And obviously that a lot of people in the community knew what happened, but didn't say anything at the time. And so these news stories caused the Mississippi Attorney General to reopen the case into the murders of these 3 young men. And in 2005, Edgar Ray Killen was convicted of manslaughter. He was the one that the bodies were buried on his property. He was one of the main leaders of the Ku Klux Klan in the area, even though I thought there was no Ku Klux Klan in the area, according to Senator Eastland. And so he was convicted and sentenced to 60 years. He was in his 80s by this point. And he died, I had been looking it up for years. He died, I think, in like 2019 in jail. So he did spend some time in jail, but it was, this is 40 years after the murders happened that he actually was convicted and went to jail. Then in 2016, Mississippi officially ends its investigation into the murders. Obviously, after so much time, lots of people passing away, obviously there's not a lot of physical evidence left after all these years. They officially decide that they have no more leads, and they close the case. There's maybe, well, okay. Let's go ahead and do questions. I will say there's a couple of things that I will put, I will maybe send them to Robert and he can share them with you all via email. A few resources, a few documentaries. This painting here was painted, I don't know if you can see down here in the bottom right corner, by Norman Rockwell. And if you know anything about Norman Rockwell, this is not his typical kind of painting. I mean, he did do the Ruby Bridges painting that was really famous, but we think of the, family around the Thanksgiving table with the big turkey, or, children ice skating, and, these kind of like very idyllic American scenes. And this was his, the public was just so impacted by these murders, and it really shone a very bright light on the violence that was happening in the South regarding civil rights. And so this is his depiction of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, and you can just see these shadows here in the side. There are also several songs written about this, and I can send you guys links to some of the songs. One thing that I would like to point out is the bodies were discovered on August 4th, 1964. One year and 2 days later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law by President Johnson. So one thing that I'm not trying to make this, unicorns and kittens and rainbows or anything like that, but I think it's really important to think about these young people and the impact that they were in Mississippi. They lost their lives to fighting for the right to vote. And 1 year and 2 days later, the Voting Rights Act is passed. And so I think one thing is, although it's a very tragic story and very sad, and unfortunately not uncommon for this violence to happen at the time. But I think it's important to recognize that these movements, led by students, led by young people, led by Black leaders, led by Black women, that we often do not tell their stories enough, of Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, is that, these movements advanced federal legislation so quickly, and something that it's very hard to imagine that happening so quickly in this day and age when everything moves at a snail's pace. So I think that's a really important thing to recognize. So, all right.
So Mallory, wonderful job as expected. So folks, if you could get your questions into the Q&A, that would be great. And Mallory, I didn't mean to.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Sorry. No, you're fine. No, I am ready to answer any questions. I'm sorry that I ran a couple of minutes late.
Oh.
I'm seeing a lot of people drop some good resources in the chat.
Yeah, no, I think.
Okay, so.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Q&A I see, were the barriers to vote then worse or the same as today? Great question. But I think it depends on who you mean, whose barriers, what barriers to vote, and what barriers are being put in place to prevent who from voting. Obviously the Voting Rights Act did a lot, but in 2013, the Voting Rights Act was basically gutted by the Supreme Court. One of the main sections of it that made it very potent, where states, if they wanted to, states who had previously had a certain percentage of Black voters like not registered, there was a certain like formula that they used of like Black citizens versus Black voters who were registered. And so they kind of took a snapshot and they said, okay, states that meet this qualification or counties that meet this qualification have to be overseen by the federal government if they want to change their voter laws. And in that Supreme Court case ruling, basically they were like, oh, this works so well, we don't need it anymore. And right after that is when we saw the uptick in voter ID laws and lots of voter suppression, both legislation here in Texas and other places. So both legislation, but also like more informal and like not legal ways of suppressing the vote as well. So the title of the Norman Rockwell painting, so I'm sorry, I didn't really fully answer your question. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think there are many more African-American voters, percentage-wise registered today than there were in the 1960s. But I think there are just different barriers that are present to voting now. I think we're definitely going backwards for sure. The Norman Rockwell painting is called Murder in Mississippi. And then so there are voter ID. I'm not like any kind of like voter ID. I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A. I'm trying to read the chat, but there's a lot that I haven't been able to get to. I'm not any kind of voting scholar, but a lot of, even though you might have had to have some kind of verification of your identity when you go to vote, a lot of the voter ID laws that kind of get clumped together make it more difficult or require very specific kinds of ID that especially for older people or people who have low incomes, it might be harder for them to get and therefore harder for them to register or harder for them to participate in the process. The name of the song that I would have played, and I can send these things also along to you all. The song was Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, and it's by Tom Paxton. There's also a song by Simon and Garfunkel, and I'm trying to remember what it's called. I can send it in my list of resources, but actually Michael Goodman went to school with Simon and Garfunkel, and so they knew him and wrote a song about it as well. So there's several songs out there about this incident. The Tom Paxton song is just so haunting and really, I mean, the poetry of the lyrics it's very eerie, and the way that he describes the events is just, it's wild and very, very moving. So
questions in the chat, Mallory. I just want to make sure we get to them before we wrap up. Lisa asks, where were the men killed? Were they on the road being chased? Do we know that?
They were not killed in the car. They were removed from the car and killed elsewhere. But yes, it all started at the jail. It all started basically the reason why they were held there for so long is because the Klan was tipped off that they were there. Obviously, they also knew because the sheriff and the deputy sheriff, but Cecil Price, the deputy sheriff, kind of orchestrated a lot of what happened after they left the jail.
Irene asks, do you think that many Southerners felt betrayed by LBJ?
Yes. So 1964 was also an election year. All right. LBJ pushed for the Civil Rights Act, and that was surprising to a lot of his Southern allies, especially his mentor, whose name escapes me, from Georgia. Oh my God. Senator Russell. They fought about the Civil Rights Act, and LBJ famously said with some of his advisors, a lot of his advisors said it's an election year. If you want to get reelected, your Southern voting base is not going to vote for you if you try and push this through. And he famously said, what the hell is the presidency for? Essentially, what the hell is the presidency for? Like, why does it matter if I'm not like leveraging my power to do something? Not trying to turn LBJ into a saint or anything, but in that specific case, he did take a lot of political risk. That political risk paid off for him, because in the election of 1964, while he did lose every single deep Southern state, if you look at the map, basically Goldwater got Arizona, which was his home state, and then all the states of the Deep South, because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And another thing that LBJ famously said was that doing this was going to turn the South Republican for the next 100 years. And he's a very knowledgeable and astute politician. So, a lot of historians can show that obviously the shift kind of started a little bit before, but this was kind of the shift that really started to change the alignment of the parties, where those Southern Dixiecrats or Southern Democrats started realigning in the late 60s, early 70s and 80s to the Republican Party.
So let's see here. Ron says, excellent session. Thank you and enjoy your summer. Angelina says this was very informative. Michelle says this was great. Thank you. And we had a few questions earlier in the chat, but I think you kind of addressed them during the presentation. Stephanie says this was outstanding. So why don't we wrap it there, Mallory? Mallory, do you have any last words for the group?
No, I hope you all enjoyed it. I mean, not enjoyed murder, but you know what I mean. I hope you learned something, and I will share some resources with you all, because I know this always sparks a lot of interest to people who have heard about it and also hear different parts of the story that they hadn't heard before. And so I'm so glad that you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Great. Thanks so much, Mallory. And Tracy, I apologize we didn't sufficiently answer your question, but we're actually doing a program next month on this very topic. So stay tuned, check your email for me. I'll make sure to pass it along to you. But thank you all so much. Thank you, Mallory. Look for that email tomorrow with the feedback survey, with hopefully this recording and with information about some other upcoming virtual presidential library visits. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day. Have a good one, Mallory. Bye-bye.
Bye.